There is a specific moment in the dynamic between a narcissist and their target that changes everything. Not the moment the target finally sees the narcissist clearly. Not the moment they understand the manipulation or name the pattern or arrive at the painful, clarifying recognition of what they have actually been living inside. Those moments matter enormously, but they are interior moments, private, invisible to the narcissist. And as long as they remain interior, as long as the target continues to react, continues to engage, continues to produce the emotional responses that the narcissist's entire operation depends on, the dynamic does not change. The moment that changes everything is different. It is the moment the target stops reacting, not the moment they feel less, not the moment they care less or love less or hurt less. The moment they simply externally, visibly, in the space between them and the narcissist, go quiet. Stop producing the response. Stop feeding the machine. Stop giving the narcissist the one thing their psychological survival depends on more than anything else in the world, the reaction, welcome to mind vision. Today we are going into one of the most psychologically fascinating, most strategically important, and most personally liberating things you will ever understand about the narcissistic dynamic. What narcissists actually do when you stop reacting. Not what they say they will do. Not what their behavior implies they might do. What they actually, consistently, almost universally do, because the pattern is so predictable. Once you understand the psychology underneath it, that it becomes almost impossible to be surprised by. And understanding it in advance, before you stop reacting, before you implement the quiet that changes everything, is what makes the difference between holding your ground through what comes next and being pulled back in by something you were not prepared to see. So let's start where everything in the narcissistic dynamic starts. With the supply. Narcissistic supply is the term psychologists use to describe the external validation, attention, and emotional response that narcissists require to regulate their internal psychological state. And unlike most psychological concepts that can feel abstract or clinical when you first encounter them, narcissistic supply becomes immediately, viscerally understandable the moment you apply it to lived experience. The narcissist does not have a stable internal sense of self. This is the foundational psychological reality underneath all of the behavior, the grandiosity, the manipulation, the control, the rage, the charm, the cycling between idealization and devaluation. Underneath all of it is a self that is not anchored, not solid, not capable of maintaining its own sense of worth, reality, and psychological coherence without continuous external input. Most people can sit alone in a room and feel reasonably okay about themselves. Not perfectly, not without the normal human fluctuations of doubt and insecurity, and the ongoing negotiation with one's own limitations, but reasonably, sustainably okay. The internal anchor holds. The sense of self does not require constant external reinforcement to remain functional. The narcissist cannot do this. The internal anchor does not hold. In the absence of external validation, in the absence of admiration, attention, emotional reaction, or any form of engagement that confirms their existence and their significance, the narcissist experiences something that functions psychologically like free fall, not metaphorical free fall. The specific, visceral, deeply threatening internal experience of a self that has no stable ground to stand on. This is why supply is not optional for the narcissist. It is not a preference or a personality quirk or a tendency toward needing more affirmation than the average person. It is a psychological necessity, as fundamental to their functioning as oxygen is to physical survival. And the person in relationship with a narcissist, the person who has been providing that supply through their reactions, their emotions, their engagement, their very presence, is not just a partner or a friend or a family member. They are the anchor. And when the anchor stops, when the reactions stop, when the emotional engagement withdraws, when the supply is cut, the narcissist does not simply feel disappointed or hurt, or even particularly angry in the ordinary sense of those words. They feel the free fall. And everything they do next is a response to that free fall. Every behavior, every tactic, every shift in approach that follows your decision to stop reacting is the narcissist's nervous system doing whatever it takes, whatever it has ever worked to do, to make the free fall stop. Understanding this is everything, because it reframes what comes next from something that might look like genuine emotion or genuine change or genuine anything into what it actually is, a survival response. Desperate, predictable, and entirely about them. So let's talk about what that survival response actually looks like, in sequence. Because it almost always follows a sequence, not with perfect precision, not with clockwork regularity, but with enough consistency that once you know the pattern, you can see it coming before it arrives. The first thing the narcissist does when you stop reacting is escalate. Whatever they were doing before that was producing a reaction, they do more of it. Louder, more frequently, with greater intensity. If the provocation was subtle before, it becomes less subtle. If the criticism was occasional, it becomes constant. If the manipulation was moderate, it becomes overt. If the behavior that was getting a response was relatively minor, it escalates to something designed to be impossible to ignore. This escalation is not strategic in the conscious, deliberate sense. The narcissist is not sitting down and rationally calculating that an increase in intensity will produce the response that a lower intensity failed to produce. It is more instinctive than that, more desperate, more driven by the raw urgency of a system that is experiencing the withdrawal of something it absolutely cannot function without. But the effect is strategic regardless of the intent. And it is designed, whether consciously or not, to find the threshold at which your commitment to non-reaction breaks. To locate the specific trigger that will pull you back into emotional engagement. To make the silence so uncomfortable, so untenable, so impossible to maintain that you respond simply to make it stop. This is the moment most people break, not because they are weak, but because the escalation is specifically calibrated to the things that matter most to them. The narcissist, who has been studying them for months or years, knows exactly what buttons to push, knows the specific fears, the specific insecurities, the specific relational wounds that are most likely to produce a reaction, even from someone who has made a genuine commitment to not reacting, and they push them, all of them, in whatever combination and whatever sequence produces the result they need. Holding through this phase requires something that most people dramatically underestimate, not just the decision to not react, but the psychological preparation for the specific, targeted, personally calibrated nature of what the escalation will look like. If you know it is coming, if you have understood in advance that the escalation is not evidence that you did something wrong, but evidence that the supply withdrawal is working, you have a fighting chance of holding through it. If you do not know it is coming, it will almost certainly pull you back in. The second thing the narcissist does when escalation fails to produce a reaction is something that surprises almost everyone the first time they encounter it. They become kind, not gradually, not incrementally, suddenly, with a completeness and a warmth and an apparent sincerity that can be genuinely, deeply disorienting to someone who has spent months or years being treated with exactly the opposite. The charm that was present at the very beginning of the relationship, the version of the narcissist that made you fall in love, or trust them or want them in your life in the first place, reappears, as though it was never gone. As though the person who was escalating moments ago and the person who is now being tender and apologetic and apparently genuinely remorseful are two entirely different people. They remember things. The specific things that used to matter to you, the small kindnesses, the particular ways of showing care that landed best, the specific love language that they learned early in the relationship and deployed strategically throughout it. They deploy them now with a precision that feels almost uncanny, given how absent all of it has been in recent history. They apologize, sometimes specifically, with apparent awareness of exactly what they did wrong and genuine-sounding remorse about the impact. Sometimes broadly, I know I have not been good to you. I know I have been difficult. I know you deserve better. The apology is calibrated to what they believe will be most effective, most likely to reopen the emotional channel, most likely to produce the warmth and the re-engagement and the restoration of supply that the switch to kindness is designed to achieve. And here is the cruelest psychological truth about this phase. For many people, for most people, in fact, who have not fully understood this pattern and prepared for it specifically, it works. Not because they are naive, not because they have forgotten what came before, but because the love is real. The hope that was present at the beginning of the relationship has not been fully extinguished. The version of the narcissist that is currently being presented, warm, remorseful, apparently aware, apparently trying, is close enough to the version they fell for that the gap between what they know and what they feel becomes, in this moment, very difficult to hold. The knowing says this is a pattern. The feeling says this feels like the person I loved. And the narcissist is counting on the feeling winning. The third thing the narcissist does when kindness fails to restore the supply is something that moves the operation into significantly more serious psychological territory. They recruit. The narcissist who cannot get a reaction from you directly will find ways to get a reaction from you indirectly. through the people around you, through the social network you share, through the process that psychologists call flying monkeys, the recruitment of third parties, sometimes consciously manipulated and sometimes genuinely deceived, who carry the narcissist's narrative to you and create the pressure and the reaction that the narcissist could not create themselves. These third parties arrive with concern, with questions, with the narcissist's version of events presented as though it were neutral information rather than a carefully constructed piece of psychological warfare. They tell you the narcissist is not doing well, that they are worried about them, that they have never seen them like this, that they think you should reach out or give them another chance, or at least have a conversation. And each of these messages is designed to do what the escalation and the kindness could not: to penetrate the silence, to produce a response, to restore the connection that the non-reaction severed. Even a negative response, even a response of anger or rejection, is preferable from the narcissist's perspective to the continuing silence. Because any response confirms engagement. Any reaction restores supply. Any emotion directed at them, however hostile, is better than the complete emotional withdrawal of genuine non-reaction. The fourth thing the narcissist does, when escalation and kindness and recruitment have all failed to break the silence, is the thing that nobody who has not encountered it would ever predict. They disappear, completely, suddenly, with the same dramatic totality that characterized everything else they did. They withdraw all contact, all presence, all the attention and engagement and emotional energy that they were just moments ago deploying with such desperate urgency. They go silent in a way that is the mirror image of your silence, but driven by an entirely different psychology. This is the narcissist's final tactical move, and it is designed to activate the specific fear that they believe is most likely to break your non-reaction. The fear of having pushed them away permanently, of having gone too far, of being responsible for the ending of something that, however damaged, was still a connection. For people with anxious attachment, for people whose deepest fear is abandonment, this final move is often the most effective of all. The narcissist withdrawing completely can feel like confirmation of the worst fear, like evidence that the silence was a mistake, like the cost of non-reaction is the very loss it was supposed to protect you from. But here is the truth that lives underneath that fear. The narcissist's disappearance is not an ending. It is a test. It is the last available move in a sequence that has run out of options. And if you hold through it, if you maintain the non-reaction through the silence that mirrors your own silence back at you, something happens that almost never happens in the narcissistic dynamic. The power shifts permanently, because the narcissist who has run the full sequence, escalation, kindness, recruitment, disappearance, and found none of it capable of producing a reaction, has encountered something their psychological system has very little experience with and almost no framework for processing. Someone who does not need them, someone whose internal anchor holds without the narcissist's presence to stabilize it, someone who can sit in the silence, absorb the escalation, decline the kindness, ignore the recruitment, and survive the disappearance, and come out the other side not broken but clearer, not depleted but freed. And that person, that specific, grounded, genuinely self-sufficient person who stopped reacting and held through everything that followed, is the one thing the narcissist's entire operation was never designed to encounter, someone it cannot work on. Now here is the cinematic moment. Here is where everything lands. Picture two people, the same dynamic, the same history, the same long, exhausting, psychologically costly relationship that preceded this moment. The narcissist, running the sequence, moving through escalation and kindness and recruitment and disappearance with the desperate, increasingly frantic energy of someone whose system is in free fall and cannot find the ground, watching every move fail, watching the silence hold, watching the person they counted on to react simply, not react, and feeling, perhaps for the first time in their relational life, what it is like to be on the receiving end of the withdrawal of something they took completely for granted, the specific, clarifying, deeply uncomfortable experience of not being able to get a response from someone they were certain they could always reach, and the person who stopped reacting. Somewhere quiet, somewhere that is entirely, peacefully their own. Not performing the non-reaction, not white-knuckling through it with clenched jaw and suppressed responses, but genuinely, increasingly, for the first time in this dynamic, free from the compulsion to respond, not because they stopped feeling, but because they finally, completely understood something that changed the feeling's relationship to their behavior. They understood that every reaction they gave was currency. and they had been spending that currency on someone who was using it not to build something but to maintain something, a dynamic, a power structure, a supply chain that was built entirely on their emotional engagement and would collapse entirely without it. They stopped spending, and in the stopping, in the quiet, deliberate, increasingly natural withholding of the reaction that kept the whole operation running, they discovered something that no amount of understanding the narcissist could have given them. They discovered themselves, separate, distinct, real and complete and sufficient, without the narcissist's presence to define the shape of their days and the content of their emotional life. They discovered that the silence was not empty. It was full of them, of their own thoughts and their own feelings and their own life moving forward, without the constant gravitational pull of someone else's need for their reaction. And sitting in that fullness, quiet and clear and genuinely, permanently free, they realized something that the narcissist never will. The most powerful thing they ever did in that relationship was nothing. This has been Mind Vision. If this episode found you at exactly the right moment, share it with someone who is trying to stop reacting and needs to know what is coming so they can hold through it. Subscribe, because every episode we go somewhere real. And remember, your silence is not weakness. Your non-reaction is not indifference. It is the most powerful statement you have ever made. And it is working. See you next time. So we left off at the power shift, that specific, permanent, quietly revolutionary moment when the person who stopped reacting holds through the full sequence. The escalation, the kindness, the recruitment, the disappearance, and discovers on the other side of it something that no amount of understanding the narcissist intellectually could have produced. Themselves. Separate, real, complete without the narcissist's presence, organizing the shape of their emotional life. And I want to start right here, not at the triumph of that discovery, because triumph is not quite the right word for something this complicated and this hard-won, but at the reality of it, the specific, textured, imperfect, genuinely human reality of what it actually looks like to stop reacting to a narcissist and live inside that decision day after day, while everything inside the dynamic is working to undo it. Because here is what most content about going gray rock, about implementing non-reaction as a strategy with a narcissist, leaves out entirely. The strategy is described as though it is primarily an external thing, a behavioral adjustment, a decision you make and then execute the way you might execute any other decision. Stop reacting, go quiet, withdraw the emotional engagement. Done. What that description completely fails to account for is what happens inside the person implementing it. The internal experience of non-reaction, when you are dealing with someone who has spent months or years learning exactly how to reach inside you and find the things that produce a response, because stopping the external reaction does not stop the internal one. Not immediately, not completely, not for a long time. The empath, the deeply feeling person, the individual who entered this relationship with a genuine and open heart and gave it everything they had, that person does not become emotionally indifferent simply because they have decided to stop showing what they feel. The feelings continue. The love continues, in whatever complicated, grief-tangled form love takes when it has survived the specific damage of a narcissistic relationship. The hurt continues, the anger continues, the specific, disorienting mixture of knowing exactly what is happening and still being affected by it continues. And here is the thing about that internal experience that most people are never told. It is not a failure of the strategy. It is not evidence that non-reaction is not working, or that you are not strong enough to sustain it, or that you should give up and try something else. The internal reaction is entirely separate from the external non-reaction. You can feel everything, and still not give the narcissist the response they are looking for. The goal is not to stop feeling. The goal is to stop performing the feeling for an audience that is using it against you. That distinction between the internal experience and the external expression is the thing that makes non-reaction sustainable. And it is the thing that most people implementing it for the first time do not fully understand, which is why they feel like they are failing every time the internal reaction is strong. You are not failing. You are feeling. And feeling is allowed. Feeling is human. Feeling is the specific, irreducible proof that you are not the narcissist, that what you bring to relationships is real rather than performed, genuine rather than strategic, worth protecting rather than suppressing. Feel everything. Show nothing. That is the practice. And it is a practice, not a state you arrive at permanently, but a skill you build through repetition, through the accumulation of moments when you felt the pull and did not follow it, when you registered the provocation and did not respond to it, when you held the quiet and discovered each time that holding it was survivable, more than survivable, clarifying. Because here is what happens inside the person who sustains non-reaction over time, and this is the part that nobody tells you is coming, because it sounds almost too good to be true when you are in the middle of the difficulty of implementing it. The internal reactions begin to change, not immediately, not in the first week or the first month, or even necessarily the first several months, but gradually, almost imperceptibly, through the sustained practice of not performing the reaction. Something in the emotional system begins to recalibrate. The provocations that used to produce immediate, visceral, full-body responses begin to produce something slightly smaller. Still felt, but felt from a slight distance, with a quality of observation rather than pure immersion, as though part of you has stepped back far enough to see the provocation for what it is, rather than only for what it feels like. Psychologists call this process emotional deconditioning. The repeated experience of a stimulus that no longer produces the expected response gradually, at the neurological level, weakens the associative link between that stimulus and that response. The narcissist's specific tactics, the particular words, tones, behaviors that have reliably produced your reaction in the past, begin to lose their charge. Not because you have stopped caring, but because the pattern has been interrupted enough times that your nervous system is beginning to update its predictions. This is one of the most liberating experiences available to someone who has been in a narcissistic dynamic. The moment when a provocation that used to devastate you lands and produces, not the devastation but a quiet, almost calm recognition. Oh, that tactic again, I know this one. And the knowing, rather than the feeling, becomes the dominant response. That moment is not the end of the journey, but it is proof that the journey is working. Now let's talk about something that most people implementing non-reaction encounter, and almost nobody prepares them for. The narcissist's adaptation. Because the narcissist, over time, does not simply keep running the same sequence indefinitely in the face of consistent non-reaction. They adapt. They are extraordinarily skilled observers of other people's responses. Their entire psychological operation depends on that observational skill. And when the current approach stops working, they begin, almost immediately, to search for an approach that will. This adaptation takes several forms, and understanding them in advance is as important as understanding the original sequence. The first adaptation is personalization. When the general tactics stop working, the narcissist moves toward increasingly specific, increasingly targeted provocations. They stop using the broad manipulation tools that worked in the past and start reaching for the things that are most uniquely, most personally significant to you. The specific insecurity they know cuts deepest, the particular relationship or achievement or aspect of your identity that you value most and are therefore most vulnerable to having attacked. The precise emotional wound that they identified early in the relationship and have been filing away ever since, for exactly this kind of moment. This phase of the narcissist's adaptation is the most dangerous phase of the non-reaction process, because it is the phase where the attacks feel the most personal, the most targeted, and the most genuinely damaging to your sense of self. It is the phase where holding the non-reaction requires not just discipline but a level of self-knowledge and self-groundedness that goes significantly deeper than simply deciding not to respond. You have to know yourself well enough in this phase to distinguish between a criticism that has genuine validity and deserves honest self-reflection, and a weaponized observation that is designed purely to destabilize you and produce a response. This distinction is genuinely difficult when you are inside the dynamic. The narcissist is skilled enough to frame the most calculated attacks in the language of honest feedback, to make manipulation sound like concern, to make destabilization sound like insight. The test is not the content of what they are saying. The test is the pattern. Genuine feedback from someone who genuinely cares about your growth is offered consistently, not selectively deployed at the exact moment when you have stopped giving them what they need. If the criticism arrives in direct proportion to your withdrawal of emotional engagement, it is not feedback. It is fuel. The second adaptation is triangulation. When direct attacks stop producing reactions, the narcissist introduces a third element, another person, another relationship, another source of competition or comparison, designed to activate the specific emotional responses that direct provocation has failed to produce. The new friend who is suddenly mentioned with suspicious frequency. the ex who is casually referenced in conversations, the colleague or acquaintance whose achievements are compared to yours in ways that are ostensibly neutral but land with a precision that suggests anything but neutrality. These introductions are not accidental. They are calculated to reach the emotional responses, jealousy, insecurity, fear of replacement, that the direct tactics have failed to reach, and they work when they work because they operate on a different emotional register than direct provocation. Direct provocation produces anger or hurt, emotions that, once identified as responses to manipulation, can be managed through the non-reaction practice. Triangulation produces fear, and fear, particularly the primal fear of being replaced or rendered irrelevant, has deeper roots and shorter fuses than almost any other emotional response. The person implementing non-reaction who has not anticipated triangulation will often find themselves suddenly, inexplicably reactive again, responding to the new person or the new comparison with an emotional engagement that they thought they had moved past. And the narcissist, observing that response, will note with precision exactly where the new lever is and press it accordingly. Anticipating triangulation, naming it for what it is before it produces its intended effect, is one of the most important pieces of preparation for the sustained practice of non-reaction. The third adaptation is the most psychologically sophisticated and the most difficult to hold against. The narcissist starts mirroring your non-reaction back at you. They become, suddenly and completely, the unbothered one. They perform, with remarkable conviction, the version of themselves that simply does not need your reaction. They seem, almost overnight, to have found the equanimity and the self-sufficiency that they were so desperately lacking when the escalation phase was in full effect. They post, they go out, they are seen being fine, more than fine, thriving, in whatever social contexts are visible to you, either directly or through the people you share. And for the person who implemented non-reaction, partly from the hope that the narcissist would finally understand the cost of their behavior, this adaptation produces a specific and painful response. The fear that the non-reaction is not working, that the narcissist genuinely does not care, that the supply withdrawal has produced not the distress that the psychology predicts, but a genuine, comfortable indifference. This fear is almost always incorrect. The performance of not caring is categorically different from not caring. And the narcissist's nervous system, which is still in the free fall that began the moment the supply was withdrawn, is not suddenly stable, simply because it has put on a convincing show of stability. But the performance is convincing enough that holding through it requires something the person implementing non-reaction may not have fully developed yet: the complete, unconditional, unshakable decision to implement non-reaction for themselves. Not for its effect on the narcissist, not as a strategy designed to produce a specific response in them, but as an act of self-preservation that has nothing to do with whether the narcissist is suffering or thriving or somewhere in between. This is the deepest and most important reframe in the entire practice of non-reaction. As long as the non-reaction is being maintained as a tactic, as something done to the narcissist rather than for the self, it remains vulnerable to the narcissist's adaptations. Because if the goal is to make them feel the withdrawal, then their performance of not feeling it can undermine the entire practice. But if the non-reaction is maintained as an act of self-love, as the specific daily, completely personal decision to stop spending emotional currency on someone who has consistently demonstrated they will not invest it in anything that nourishes you, then the narcissist's response becomes irrelevant. Whether they are suffering or performing, thriving, or somewhere unreadable in between, the practice continues. Not for them, for you. And that shift from non-reaction as strategy to non-reaction as self-care is where the practice becomes truly sustainable, where it stops requiring white-knuckle discipline and starts becoming something more natural, more integrated, more genuinely yours. And now here is the cinematic moment. Here is where everything lands. Picture the full arc. The beginning, the person full of genuine love and genuine hope investing in a dynamic that was designed to take both and return neither. The middle, the slow, expensive, increasingly disorienting process of giving reaction after reaction to someone who was using each one as fuel rather than receiving it as the genuine emotional offering it was. And now, the end of the arc. Or rather, not the end. The beginning of something else entirely. The person who stopped reacting is sitting somewhere that is completely, peacefully theirs. Not in the dramatic stillness of someone performing strength. In the ordinary, unglamorous, genuinely lived stillness of someone whose daily life is no longer organized around the emotional needs of someone else's dysfunction, They are not thinking about the narcissist sequence, not monitoring the adaptation, not bracing for the next move. Not because those things are not happening, they may be somewhere in the narcissist's world. But because the narcissist's world and their world have, through the sustained practice of non-reaction, become genuinely, functionally separate in a way they could not have imagined when they were inside the dynamic. They feel things. They still feel things. The grief of what this was. The complicated residue of love that does not simply evaporate because its object was not worthy of it. The specific sadness of having given so much to something that could not receive it. They feel all of it. And they do not perform it for anyone. They simply feel it, privately, honestly, with the specific dignity of someone who has learned that their emotions belong to themselves rather than to the person who used them as supply. And in that private, honest, completely unperformed feeling, in the quiet of a life that is being rebuilt from the inside out rather than organized around someone else's hunger, something is growing, slowly, imperfectly, with the specific, patient, unhurried pace of genuine things. Themselves, the self that was gradually, almost imperceptibly eroded by years of having their reactions treated as resources. The self that got quieter and quieter inside the dynamic as the narcissist got louder. The self that is now, in the absence of all that noise, beginning to remember what it sounds like when it speaks in its own voice, without the constant interference of someone else's need for its response. That self is not broken, was never broken, was simply for a time drowned out. And now the noise is gone and the self is here. And the silence that once felt like loss has become something else entirely. The silence is theirs now. And in it, finally, completely, for the first time in longer than they can clearly remember, they can hear themselves think. They can hear themselves feel. They can hear, in the deep and unhurried quiet of a life that belongs entirely to them, everything they were always meant to be, before the noise started. And after it ended, this has been Mind Vision. If this episode reached someone who is in the middle of implementing non-reaction and needed to know what comes next, share it. Subscribe because every episode we go somewhere real, and today we went somewhere necessary. And remember, the most powerful thing you ever gave the narcissist was your reaction, and the most powerful thing you ever gave yourself was taking it back. See you next time.